Welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing on our Python series where we're going to be taking a look at the basics of strings. So some specifics about, of course, concepts we're going to go over is we're going to see how we can modify certain string values using f-string literals and also just in general modifying certain data types. Now in addition, we're going to be taking a look at past concepts. In my previous lecture in Python, I talked about NumPy and Pandas. So we're going to take that concept, that previous concept, and connect it to what we're going to learn today. We're going to see how we can use these concepts of terms of modifying string values and also using some regular expression concepts in the scope of data science. So we're going to be connecting all of what we've learned in our previous lecture in this lecture about strings and also a bit about regular expressions. So with that being said, let's get into it. All right, so as you can see, the first thing we're going to go over, according to our comments up here, is f-string literals. So we're going to see, okay, how do we use an f-string literal in the first place, and also how will it work? How do we format an f-string literal? So first thing I'm going to do is create an object. So let's say mooks is equal to, and then since this is an f-string literal, we're going to have an f there. And then I'm going to use brackets, and I'll explain this later on, but then the next thing we're going to put is braces and then the value we want to modify. So I'm going to be using a decimal place value or a decimal value, and I'm going to say that I want to modify it like this. And of course, I'm going to explain all of this after we see the output. So this less than sign, 10, and then I'll say a precision of 0.2 decimal places. And always when you use an f-string literal, at the end of kind of your modification process here, after you say, okay, I want to modify this value in this scope, you need to place the data type, which in this case, f denotes floating point, which it is a floating point, of course, as it is a decimal value. So then we place those end quotes, and then I want to call mooks, and there you go. Okay, so first thing, as I mentioned, that I wanted to go over was the brackets. So the reason why I placed brackets here in this f-string literal was to show you guys the displacement of this value. So in other words, this less than value here is saying that I want to move this place, or rather I want to move this value 10 places to the left, 10 spaces to the left. So for example, just to kind of prove this in another way, if I place a greater than sign here, I'm going to move it 10 places to the right. So if I do that, there you go. So you can see that it kind of shows you, the purpose of the bracket here is to show you guys that it, of course, does work. That essentially we can move this value to the left or to the right. I also wanted to go over numerical values here. So if you wanted to say, for example, an integer, let's say something like that, an integer value. So I'll say sux is equal to f quote. So we say sux is equal to f, and then put a quote there, single quote. And then we have this big value, big integer value, of course. And then I'm going to say that I'm going to place a comma here. And then, of course, you'll see why I did that. But if we run this, and then you see here that I placed a d, this d emphasizes that this type is an integer value. The data type is integer, which it is, of course. And, of course, I need to run sux. There you go. So you see here, okay, we had this value here. Now the difference is, of course, we have a comma, or we have a kind of value here that said, we essentially use a comma to kind of format the value, of course. So you see here that instead of having these trailing zeros, it's more readable as 100,000, which it is 100,000. So it's pretty neat that you can say that, okay, I can place a comma here, followed by the data type, right? Essentially to say that, okay, I want to say the value as more readable, and it's going to be 100,000 instead of just saying zeros, a lot of zeros. So for example, if I did, this is 100,000, so if I placed, let's say 10 million, there you go. or 1 million, the commas will kind of work in terms of making the value more readable. All right, now another cool thing I wanted to go over in terms of strings is to use certain methods. These methods such as is all num, is alpha, is digit, is numeric, these are all going to allow us to kind of see whether the value itself is digit value, it is a numeric value, is alpha. Alpha is just saying that it is all string values, just words, just characters. And also all num is saying that it is alphanumeric, so it's all going to be words and also numbers. So for instance, I have, let's say Jukes again is equal to 800, and then I want to say that Jukes dot is numeric, true, which it is. Now for example, I said 800 times, and let's say is all num, true. And lastly, just to test alpha here, let's say cool, and then Jukes dot is alpha, true. So you can see here that these kind of methods here are testing, or rather kind of allowing us to see whether truly, if they are numeric values, if they are numeric and string values in terms of being words and characters, and also just if they are string values, or rather just words. So these methods are really helpful for us to kind of test certain string values and to see whether distinguish them as numbers or essentially as certain words. These are pretty helpful in the scope of using these in terms of kind of confirming that these values are what we want and to check them. All right, cool. So now another really nice method that I like to use is dot format. And it's pretty handy method that can also help us, I should say, to better organize our f-string literal. So how does this work? So essentially, we literally start out with quotes here. And then let's say a really neat aspect of the dot format method is that we can place variables instead of the values themselves. So for example, of course, I'm going to show you guys how this works. So I'm going to first write out a variable name, Fuchs. Again, say that this value is a floating point value, 0.4 f. And then I'm going to say another bracket, another brace here, and then let's say Jukes, and then since this is a digit value, let's place again that comma there, D. And then we say dot format, and then now here is where I need to say, okay, what these variable values are. So for instance, I said Fuchs here, I'm going to say Fuchs is equal to, again, it's a decimal place value, so 88.89898. And then Jukes is going to be, let's say, 7689, just for, there you go. So if you run that, you see here that, okay, these values were modified the way we wanted them to. We saw here that, of course, okay, we have 8 places here for Fuchs, and then we modified it to 4 decimal places, so 1, 2, 3, 4. This was before 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so we just cut 1 decimal place value. And then Jukes, as you can see in our previous kind of example here with Sux, we placed the comma there, and that comma was just going to make our value more readable. So instead of 76789, we have 76,789. You can work with this dot format method however you like to. You can even explicitly state these values. Again, we use variables in this example. So this dot format method is, again, a really helpful method that can really kind of help you organize your data and kind of modify certain values, of course, however you want to. Now here comes the big example, the big concept that we're going to go over, which is we're going to use regular expressions in the scope of some data science. So we will combine essentially concepts of NumPy as well as Pandas with this module library. So first things first, if you haven't watched my previous lecture, NumPy and Pandas, I highly recommend you do so. I have just linked it above. But regardless, we will again use NumPy and Pandas in the scope of kind of how we're going to modify string values. So what we need to do first, of course, is since NumPy and Pandas are module libraries, we need to import them. Also, as well as with regular expressions. And again, I also made a video on regular expressions. Highly recommend you guys watch that video as well. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, we need to import pandas as PD, import, let me bring this down there, import numpy as NP, and also import RE. And we don't need to say as anything because this is already very short. So let's do that. Now what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to create an array first, and then I'm going to kind of then place that as our value for pandas or for PD. So what I'm going to do here is nukes is equal to np.array, and then let's just make this very simple. So let's say James 898 cool nice 7777. Okay, and then I need to make an object for my pandas value. So PD, I'll say cooks is equal to pd.dataframe, and then nukes, and then also I'm going to label the columns. And since this is of course just one array value, we're just going to have one column, so we'll just call that chooks, and then also we need to put brackets here, do that, and then of course let's call cooks. There we go. So simple value here, simple values I should say. We have 3 index values of course, and then 1 column value chooks. Okay, next thing that I'm going to do here is where we're going to kind of see, okay, how do we want to modify these values? So what I'm going to say here is I'm going to create a function. So define func, and then these values here. Define func values. Okay, now this is where I'm going to say or utilize, I'm going to utilize regular expressions. I'm going to say sux, I'm going to create an object, re.fullmatch, and then r quotes here. So the formats of regular expressions, especially if you want to modify them, and just the format of regular expressions, keep in mind that it is r and then quotes, instead of course, f and then quotes, which was for f string literals. So I said sux is equal to re.fullmatch, r, and then a quote. We'll say, since if you see here that we have string values, or rather I should say words and characters here, and then integer values, I'm going to put these kind of delimiters in terms of parentheses. So I'm going to say, for example, since these are all string values here, I'm going to say \d, and then I'm going to make a requirement here. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 values of 4 values that are not integer values. That is what essentially the \d means. That essentially we're going to be searching for values that are not integer, or any numbers essentially. And then space, because of course we have a space in between. And then I'm going to say another parentheses, and then we say \d, and let's say 3, 4, 5. I'm going to of course say, okay, what do we want to modify? And we're going to be modifying all of these values here. So in the scope of our argument, it's going to be values. Okay, so again, just kind of a quick recap here. To format our regular expression here, I said r quote, and then I put them in parentheses here where I said \d, which is essentially the delimiter that is searching for values that are not integers. So these guys here, James, cool, and nice. And then place another parentheses with a space because they are broken up with spaces. And then I'm saying I'm going to search for values that are integers. So 898, 87656, 777. And then we're going to be modifying, of course, values. Now, after doing that, after we search for those values that do match our requirement, I'm going to say return, and then let's say asterisk here dot join sux dot groups if sux else just the values that we want. Okay, so within this last statement here, within my return statement, I'm saying that, okay, as long as these searched values or the values that we search for do match Suk's, then I'm going to join the tuples that are essentially formed from these values here and join them with this asterisk. So with Suk's.groups here, what we're doing is that we're kind of, these values that we pass in here, these regular expression delimiters, they're going to break up each of these guys, what we determine in the parentheses, as tuples. So for example, backslash d4 is going to be a tuple for James, backslash lowercase d, and then in the scope of 5 values is also going to be a tuple. So we're going to join each of them with this asterisk. So in the end, for example, if one of these guys works, for example, let's say James is going to be joined with an asterisk with its 898. So it's going to be James asterisk 898, if that works out, of course. Okay, so after we did that, I'm going to create another object. Hooks is equal to cooks.map and then func. I should actually say cooks and then brackets of the column values we want to modify, right? So shooks.map of the name of the function, which is just func. So after we do that, I want to call hooks, which I believe should already be automatically called. There we go. Okay. So what did I do here? I of course created an object hooks. I set it in equal to, of course, cooks, which was our kind of PD value here, our data frame object. In the scope of taking the columns, the column values, which was named shooks, dot map, and this dot map here will essentially kind of, okay, take this function, as we place the name of the function here, and take these values shooks and kind of use them in the scope of the function as a whole. So essentially what we did here was that we took shooks here and we're going to use them, the values of shooks, the column values, James, cool, nice, followed by these integer values, in the scope of the function func. So after we did that, of course, we went through, the program found that only cool 87656 matched the requirements, which they did. As we see here, for example, cool was 4 non-integer values, which was 1, 2, 3, 4. And then as you can see, with the next requirement, the next delimiter here, the backslash d5 is saying that we want 5 integer values, which we do. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 7, 6, 5, 6 is essentially 5 integer values. And we see here that after that requirement was met, we said that we wanted to join cool and an integer value with an asterisk, which of course we got that output. So this was just kind of example of how we can utilize regular expressions and also just NumPy pandas in the scope of kind of modifying string values and using regular expressions. So with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys learned how to kind of format string values, how to modify them, and also kind of seeing a fun example in how we can use other concepts such as regular expressions in the scope of other concepts in the scope of data science in Python. So I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one.